Good morning. Happy New Year and welcome to the first of the year EOR Insights. Thank you for True Companies for welcoming us again to this nice room. We've got a great presentation today. I'd like to introduce Mr. Robert Downey with Shale Ingenuity. Mr. Downey has over 40 years of experience in upstream oil and gas and energy technology development. Prior to Shale Ingenuity, he held numerous executive and technical professional positions, including Amoco in Canada, Synthetic Genomics, Cirrus Energy Inc., and Gunnison Energy. Robert has been awarded several patents in coal bioconversion, reservoir simulation modeling, reservoir engineering, and well drilling and completions. Mr. Downey earned a BS in petroleum engineering from the Colorado School of Mines and lives near Denver. So we thank Robert for coming up. I think you'll find his presentation quite interesting. We'll have plenty of time for questions, and I'm sure Robert would enjoy those questions. So welcome and thank you for coming.
So hydraulic fracturing, first of all, these things keep popping up here. Okay, got it. So my name is Robert Downey. I'm a petroleum engineer, and the talk this morning is about cyclic hydraulic fracture stimulation technology. So when you think about hydraulic fracturing, it was first field tested in Kansas in 1947 by Amoco. They got a patent on that. They licensed it exclusively to Halliburton a couple of years later. First large-scale use was done on tight formation gas sands in the 1970s. More than 2.5 million hydraulic fracture stimulations have now been completed worldwide. It's credited with adding 9 billion barrels of oil and 700 TCF of gas to U.S. reserves. It's enabled the development of massive shale formations with horizontal wells, multiple fracs since 2008. It's characterized by high pumping rates and pressures and massive fluid and proppant volumes. It creates very large planar tensile fractures that extend hundreds of feet in length and height. Frac models such as Gopher, Frac Pro, and others are developed to model these planar tensile fractures. There's about 240 frac fleets operating in the U.S. today. Utilization is about 77%. And the refracs are increasingly considered to increase recovery from depleted wells. This improved hydraulic fracturing stimulation technology is needed to get better wells and boost reserve at a lower cost. Okay. I'll just page down. Well, I got it here. I'll just move forward this way. Can't do it with the mouse. I do it with the mouse. It's just not working. Okay. Thanks. Okay, so CycleStim is a next generation stimulation solution characterized by low rate, low proppant load cyclic well stimulation treatment. It works in unconventional and conventional oil and gas formations, but think mostly shales, tight sands, conglomerates, carbonates, coal bed methane. You don't need chemical additives. You can use produced water, has a much lower treatment cost, requires less than 10% of the hydraulic horsepower of a typical frac job, a lot less manpower, provides a more sustainable oil and gas production performance and increases production in EUR, has lower environmental impact, and you can collect real-time data analytics to quantify your treatment effectiveness while you're doing it. Now, this is not new technology. This was technology was invented by accident by a frac consultant named Othar Keel in 1974. He was out doing a frac job for Belding and Blake in Stevens County, Oklahoma. And in the middle of his frac job, his pump trucks broke down. So he had to shut down and then come back the next day, finish the job. And he noticed a couple months after that, that the well was outperforming the other ones that had conventional treatments in the field. And he realized that shutting down and then pumping again caused the creation of a second fracture, which enabled better inflow performance into that well. After that, he started doing those treatments as a matter of course, and he completed over 400 wells during the period from 74 to 77. He published a really nice paper for the SPE, but most recently, this technology has been used in Southeast Asia by PetroChina and Pertamina, and they've had successful treatments been done in the Eagle Ford and in the Horn River Basin in 2012 and 2017. Technical papers on that. Oh, hold on a second here. All right, try that again. Okay, so this is a picture of a cyclic hydraulic fracture treatment being conducted in the Sichuan Basin of China. There's been, like I said, over 550 of these treatments done worldwide. Really good inflow performance increase, outperformed conventional fracs. So why cyclic stimulation? Well, when you think about on the right, the well bores, you create a single planar fracture, you increase the amount of surface area that oil and gas has to flow into the wellbore. If you can create multiple fractures, you can really increase that inflow performance into the well. It's pretty simple, right? But we don't do that as an industry. If you compare CycleStim to traditional hydraulic fracture stimulation, and I won't go through this table, you can read it later. There's lots of benefits to it and virtually no downside to it. About the only downside I can tell you is it takes longer to do these treatments. You can't rig up and do the treatment and walk away within a day. So where's it been done? Well, like I said, in 73, Othar did the first accidental cyclic stimulation treatment, more than 400 done from 74 to 77. From 2010 to 2012, PetroChina did multiple treatments in shale gas wells. In 2012, SM Energy and Schlumberger did a treatment in an Eagle Ford well. 2017, Horn River Basin, horizontal shale gas wells were treated this way. There's been a number of treatments in Korean geothermal wells. Cyclic stimulation was done in 24 vertical wells in China by PetroChina in 2022. And then what really important paper by Pertamina, I'll talk about a little bit, was done in 2022, where they used this process and treated wells in a mature water flood. So this is ongoing mostly overseas. The US oil and gas industry really hasn't picked up on this. I think it will. And I'll cite a couple papers here, the ones in blue, but there's a number of papers out in the literature, in the technical literature about this technology. It is not new. Our approach to it is kind of different, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but this is technology that's around, but it's one of those things that the oil industry has just overlooked. I started with Amoco in 1976, and we had a big research center and really good guys doing research on hydraulic fracture stimulation, but our focus was on creating big planar bi-wing tensile fracs and packing them full of sand and carrying as many pounds per gallon as you possibly could into the fracture. And we really weren't thinking about ways to create multiple fractures. So this is a table that came out of the paper that Othar Kale published in 76 about the frac jobs he did. I can just tell you that he treated wells all over the country. Back then they're all vertical, of course, but both oil and gas wells in various different basins, including a few basins up here in Wyoming. As I mentioned, the PetroChina, they published a really nice paper. And by the way, if anybody's interested, I can provide you copies of these papers. They did a treatment on the first vertical shale gas well in 2010, the first treatment in the horizontal multi-stage shale gas well in 2011, and then they've done multiple cyclic stimulation treatments in a couple different oil fields in China. The Chinese, by the way, are pretty aggressive at their research. My company routinely gets lots of hits from Chinese companies. I mean, they are very interested in oil and gas technology. So I mentioned this paper in 2012. The SM Energy was drilling some wells in the Eagle Ford. They had 2 Eagle Ford shale wells. They did what they call the relaxofrac treatment, where they did 2 injection cycles. They pumped, stopped, pumped again. And they did that on a couple wells, and they showed that they increased the microseismic events and they generated a greater ESV, effective stimulated volume. And you got 23% greater overall production from the offset well. You say, well, why didn't they keep doing those? Well, my guess is, 2012 was in the growth of the Eagle Ford shale play. The management there probably said, no, I don't want to mess around with this stuff. Let's keep drilling wells. So that happens a lot. 2017, University of Calgary, a rock mechanics company called Itasca and an unnamed operator published this paper. They called it short interval reinjection, and they did some treatments on 2 wells in the Horn River Shale, 3 stages in one well and 9 stages in another well. They didn't publish the production results, but they did show that you could model this process with a sophisticated 3D rock mechanics model. As I mentioned the models earlier, like Gopher and Frac Pro, they can't model these treatments. It's too complex, but there are rock mechanics models out there that can. In 2019, PetroChina published a paper where they talked about some wells they treated in the Ordos Basin, which is in the Chang 7 formation, which is a pretty brittle formation. It's not known to be easy to treat, but they got really good results from that. Big increase in their post-frac rate at 2 times the SRV they got with conventional fracs, and they saved about 15% on the cost. It's a great paper, by the way. Some friends of mine up in Calgary called Terralog have been doing some treatments for PetroChina the last 4 or 5 years. Being Canadians, they call their treatment process slow and easy, but it's the same kind of thing. They've published a really nice paper in 2019. This is an excerpt from a report that was internal at PetroChina, where they talked about the improvement they had from doing this. So PetroChina does a lot of these treatments now. There's some cyclic stimulation research that was done at the University of Oklahoma on cores. The guys were more interested in finding out whether they could reduce the amount of hydraulic horsepower required to do a frac job by doing a cyclic injection to start the process. And they published 2 really good PhD dissertations and a couple of good SPE papers. So this is out of an ERTEC paper they published in 2020, where they showed they got a big increase in the amount of fracturing they had in the cores versus just a conventional single bi-wing planar frac. They also showed that even when you stop pumping, you have good retained permeability. And that's because when you do these treatments, you're pumping at a slow rate. So you're not causing the rock to fail in tension, you're causing the rock to fail in shear. So one side of the fracture actually moves relative to the other. And when you stop pumping and the fracture closes, because of the surface asperity, you have some retained permeability. And that's what they showed with their work. Paper that Terralog published in 2021 on CycleStim, cyclic hydraulic fracture stimulation. They talked about some work they did, 60 treatments for PetroChina. They got an average IPR increase. IPR stands for inflow performance ratio. They got an average IPR increase of 8x. So they increased the inflow in that well for given pressure drop by a factor of 8.5. Big improvement. Typically don't get that with the conventional fracs. There's just a couple graphs out of that paper talking about the increase, average oil production increase, 115 barrels a day, 1,440%. These are old vertical wells. They're producing oil and gas. Average restim oil production increase, 1,400%. It virtually no failures. Here's how this works. It's not terribly complicated. They start with doing step rate tests. So if you don't know what that is, you start pumping, and when you get to a point where your rock begins to fracture, you notice a breakover, your fluid rate increases at the same amount of pressure, so you know you've started initiating a fracture in the rock. So you confirm that initial fracture initiation pressure. What you want to do then is you want to pump at a low rate, just slightly above that pressure, so that you cause the fractures to propagate in shear, not tension. And then you stop pumping, let the well return back to its original pressure, and then pump again. On the second and third and subsequent injections, you cause fractures to propagate in different directions because the first time you create that fracture, you create stresses along the fracture face. You've now changed the stress regime. And when you allow that fracture to close and start pumping again, because of that change in stress, the fractures want to propagate in a different direction. If I had a rocks mechanics model output here, I could show you how that works. But this really does happen. And if you pump 8 cycles, you're going to create 8 big fractures. So this is what they've been doing quite successfully. And Terralog hasn't been able to convince anybody in Canada to try it yet. And it's been difficult for me to get people interested in doing it in the US. But I know Wyoming pretty well. I worked for Amoco for 10 years, worked on a lot of Wyoming basins before, during, and after that time. And I know you've got a lot of depleted wells up here that might benefit from this. It's not high tech, it's not high cost. It's something that might work. I've got a report over here that I'd be happy to show you. My wife is a reservoir engineer, and she graduated from mines as I did in '76 and went to work for Amoco. And she did reservoir engineering reports. And one of the reports is on Little Buffalo Basin 10 sleep. Well, the 10 sleep's an Aeolian reservoir and has directional permeability. Those wells weren't stimulated when they completed them, acid stimulation treatments, but not fracs. And the question is, well, could this benefit? Well, yeah, if you can create small fractures around your well bores, you might be able to access some of that bypassed oil in those Aeolian and high permeability channels. So this is just more treatment data per cycle. People were asking me, how big are these cycles? How long does it take? How much volume do you use? How much sand? The typical proppant load is about 0.05 pounds per gallon. You don't need a lot of frac sand, and it's small sand. So it's 40/70, not 10/20 or 20/40. So you don't need a lot of proppant because you're creating shear fractures, and they have retained permeability even after they close. So this is a really interesting paper. And if you're in Wyoming and you're working in water floods, this would be really, really interesting because this was a paper done by Pertamina. They're a very large oil company based in Indonesia. They did these treatments in a mature water flood, and they published this paper in '22. These are layered sandstones and limestones. This is a mature pressure depleted field, pretty watered out, had variable perms from 2 to 72 millidarcies. They conducted 11 cyclic hydraulic fracture stimulation treatments and 9 water injection wells and 2 producing wells. They had great results. And they go into some detail in this paper about what they did and how they analyzed results and why it worked. And I think there's a lot of water floods in Wyoming, not only the Bighorn Basin, but the Powder River Basin that could really benefit from this. As far as CycleStim performance, if you've been on conventional frac jobs, you know that the whole idea is you pump real hard, you shut in, you get your shut-in pressure, and then you run your plug and you start your next treatment. And the whole idea is to get things done quickly and move off the location and put your well back on production. Here, the emphasis is on understanding what's going on with the fracture treatment. So with data analytics, if you measure the data, you can determine your generated fracture volume during the treatment, the fracture surface area during the treatment, the fracture type, whether it's a shear or tensile fracture, the effective near wellbore and distant effective frac permeability, and your IPR, inflow performance ratio. You can optimize your treatment fluids and fluids of proppant volumes, the number of cycles, cycle timing, and the fracture complexity and connectivity volume by doing that. And it's not difficult to do. So some of the diagnostics can be done with surface pressure gauge equipment. So you hook up a pressure gauge on your wellhead. You've got a fluid-filled system. So you use digital pressure gauges and you just use conventional PFOT software to measure these things. You can measure the change in your KH or your fracture with each one of these treatments. You can also hire seismos. They can come out and hook a device on your wellhead that's similar to, doing a sonar ping. And they send a wave down the well, it comes back up, and they can calculate the volume you created with your fracture. Seismo does this pretty routinely now. They've got a relationship with Liberty Frac Services, and they do this on a lot of wells. So they charge about $10,000 a day for doing that. There's another company called ShearFrac, and they're based in Houston, and they use acoustics. They measure the acoustic response measurement of the fractures, and they can differentiate between shear fractures and tensile fractures. They can tell you whether you're creating shear fractures or not. That's another way to confirm how well this process works. And of course, you can use microseismic, and depending on, your formation characteristics and the rock between the formation and the surface, it can be accurate or not so accurate, but microseismic in certain cases will really help as well. So what does this look like out on a well site? Well, you don't need much. You need a pumper, a pump truck, and a blender. Since you're only pumping between 6 and 10 barrels a minute, some cementer trucks could do that. If not, you might need 2 cement trucks, but certainly not more than 1 frac truck, a sand loader, a data trailer, a diesel generator set, a couple guys out on location. You might need, depending on your location, some water tanks or frac tanks, sand truck or sand box, and a personnel truck. Depending on the logistics, you may not need a lot of equipment on location for water storage. So here's an example. I did an analysis for an operator in the San Juan Basin. They have a bunch of legacy Manco shale wells, vertical wells. And these wells are pretty depleted, producing 1 to 2 barrels a day. They wanted to know whether or not this technology might help them. Well, being a reservoir engineer, I like to run reservoir simulation models. And I said, well, the first thing to do is let's get a history match on your well. And so I can match your model parameters, and then I can run a couple what if cases. So we did that. And so I got a history match. This well was about 5,500 feet deep, had a single stage vertical frac, calculated 620-foot frac length, 50-foot frac height, and frac permeability 261 feet. Got a good forward production forecast, assuming a constant bottom hole pressure. So then I said, okay, what if I can change that frac from a single planar frac to a frac that's got some complexity along that plane? A refrac basically that creates more fractures in the near wellbore area. And I can do that either small, medium, or large. So these are 40-foot frac blocks, by the way. Each cell is 40 by 40. So we're not going out a huge distance from the wellbore by doing that. But I said, let's model that. I use CMG software. They've got the ability to impute complex fractures in reservoirs in a Cartesian grid. So that's what I used to model this. So I took that history match model, I modeled these additional fractures, and I looked at the resulting production increase. Now remember, I'm holding my bottom hole pressure constant. So you can see, the increased size of production you get depending on the size of the resulting frac you can create along that planar frac. And if you look at it on a rate versus a cumulative versus time curve, you can see that the medium and large fracs really boost the reserves. You run the economics on that. The small fractures didn't really make any money, but the medium and the larger fractures showed you can generate a nice rate of return, get a pretty fast payout on that injection, that treatment cost, and boost your reserves and extend the life of your well for 5 to 10 years. So this is on a depleted Manco shale well. So just to summarize, single stage hydraulic modeling was done on this well to forecast oil recovery. We did 3 different sizes of complex fracturing. The fracture permeability was about 5% of the hydraulic modeled planar frac perm. So I only used 5% of that, the permeability for those additional fractures we created. Complex fracture height was the same as a planar frac height, 60 feet. And you can see the resulting production increase there in the table. You can also apply this technology in horizontal wells. You can improve your oil recovery per well, improve your oil recovery between wells, enable reduced lateral spacing. A lot of people extend their lateral spacing out for fear that they're going to fracture into offset wells. Leave a lot of reserves behind because of that. You can reduce your frac hits and your interference. If you know what's going on while you're fracking, you can tell if you're starting to pressure communicate with an offset well. You can reduce your parent-child problem. Parent-child problem is caused by stress regime changes along the lateral. And of course, you can enable ultra EOR, which is an enhanced oil recovery process we invented. So in horizontal fractures, you do it just like you would with a conventional frac job, where you start out at the toe, you isolate the stage perfs and start doing these pump ins, 6 to 8 barrels a minute for an hour to 2 hours, and then shut in, allow the pressure to fall off, and then repeat, and measure your change in KH after each cycle. And then you move up to the next stage and so on. People say, well, what happens if you start seeing pressure communication behind your uphole packer? And that just means, well, you got communication, you're probably going to either need to make that stage wider or move up the hole. So I haven't done many of these in horizontal wells yet, but I think it's got great application. All the modeling I do in horizontal shale wells shows that they're grossly understimulated for the most part. So we started working with an operator in the Piceance Basin a couple of years ago. This was a paper that they published, in 2014. They're focused on the Williams Fork formation, so they have stacked sands and shales in between the sands, and the focus has been on just perforating the individual sand lenses and doing small volume slickwater frac treatments. In fact, one of the operators just went to just pumping the slickwater with no proppant because they were creating shear fractures. So we pointed out that if they had done cyclic stimulation, they would have not only done a better job of fracturing those lenticular sands, but they probably would have been able to contact the shales that have much lower permeability, that are full of gas, and generate a lot more gas out of the shales that they're not recovering now. Okay, so in the Williams Fork, they showed, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of natural shear fractures, and all they were really doing is activating the shear fractures by doing those small volume slickwater treatments. But if they had gone out and done a cyclic stimulation, they create a much more complex fracture around those well bores and more effectively drain not only the gas in the sands, but in the intervening shales. And this brought to mind the Wamsutter field. When I was an operations engineer for Amoco in 1978, we were drilling lots and lots of Wamsutter Lewis Shale gas wells. And the whole trick for us was to try to minimize our frac height growth and maintain the fractures just within those little lenticular sandstones, not realizing that the shales between the sandstones are full of gas. And so that's something that, as an industry, we tend to overlook things. When we get focused on a certain thing, you kind of miss the big picture. And of course, no one back in those days were thinking that you could get gas out of a shale. When I went to get promoted to district engineer in Farmington, New Mexico in 1980, my boss came into my office the first day and told me he wanted me to send a teletype to the Denver office to tell him he wanted him to plug that research well. And I had no idea what he was talking about. Well, it was a research well that the Amoco Research Center was drilling to test whether you could produce gas out of coal seams. And of course, they didn't want to plug the well. We put a gas lift system in it, and a couple months later, it kicked off, making about 400 MCF a day. And after that, it was his well. So that's the kind of thing we see routinely in our as we work through our time in the industry. We see this kind of stuff happen all the time. Okay. So how do you plan a CycleStim treatment? Well, it's no different than planning a regular frac job. Although I would say that the best thing you can do is use a three-dimensional rock mechanics model to help you really understand, if you have the rock mechanics data to put into the model, to help you model how effective these treatments are going to be. And then, of course, you can take the output from those models and put them into a reservoir simulation model and really predict what the performance is going to be after you do the treatment. Models today are great. I mean, the math is outstanding. I use models every day. If you have good data to go in them, you can get good results. But the treatment design is really no different than you would for conventional frac treatment. So where could you do this in Wyoming? Well, like I said, the Bighorn Basin water floods come to mind. Most of those water floods, those wells weren't fracked for fear that they were going to cause a channel between injector and a producer. And that would be the case if you did a big frac job on one. But if you did a CycleStim treatment and just improved your near wellbore IPR, you probably would get some increased oil recovery and be able to cover some oil from some bypass channels in the sand. Wind River Basin, obviously, I think about Madden Field and some of those the sands there. It could probably benefit from refracs. Powder River Basin, you got the Minnelusa, the Shannon, Frontier. These treatments would be very effective there as well. Pinedale and Jonah. I worked at Encana for 5.5 years. During time we were drilling lots of Jonah wells. We weren't thinking about the shales. There's a lot of gas in the shale between those sands. But so these refracs could work really well to help boost the production and the drainage of the gas in Jonah. And then of course Moxa and Wamsutter. Wamsutter's got hundreds of wells that I think are pretty depleted now if they're not being plugged these days, but they could probably benefit from this technology. I haven't done any modeling for any operators up here yet. I think this is a great application technology for Wyoming. This is not complex. It's not pie in the sky. It's not unproven. You see all these technical papers that show that it works. Haven't seen one that said didn't work. It's not complex to implement. It's not complex to understand. It just takes a little bit of innovation, a little bit of testing in the field. And then once it's shown to be working, then I think it'll take off. Thank you for giving me the time to come up and talk about cyclic hydraulic fracturing. I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have. Yes, sir.
The fluids are you using for these? You mentioned slick water, but are you using any viscosity at all? Or?
Yeah, so the question was, what kind of fluids are you using? Are you using slick water or using anything with viscosity or anything? No, you don't need slick water. You're only pumping at 8 barrels a minute, so your pressure drop down the tubing is minimal, so you don't need to add a surfactant. I would say, though, if you're going to do these treatments in a depleted sand well, the gas sand well, like Wamsutter, I would not use water. I would bullhead it with some Y-grade solvent, some Y-grade natural gas liquids. The reason for doing that is if you pump water into a depleted sandstone, there's a good chance you're going to increase your relative permeability to water, reduce your well perm to gas, and basically cause a water block in the near wellbore area. And you won't be able to have enough pressure to unload that water. So if you used a Y-grade, which is unfractionated natural gas liquids, if you pump that in there, once you stop pumping, that Y-grade is going to get heated up by the formation. When you open it up, it's going to want to expand and flow back up the well. So that's what I would use on gas wells. I'm not sure you need it on oil wells, but for gas wells, that's what I'd use. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, that's pretty crazy, huh? I've done a couple oil fracs down in the San Juan Basin, just no problem pumping it. We didn't know it was dangerous. We just pumped it, right? Yeah.
Cycles, doing the pad, the water breakdown followed by sand or proppant laden fluid.
Yeah, so each one of those treatments, you saw that treatment graph. Yeah, so the question again was, when you pump these treatments, are you pumping water followed by sand? And so the answer, again, if you go back to that one slide that I had there, where I had the treatment schedule at the bottom, you'll notice if you look real close that after they did the step rate test, then they started each treatment and they'd start with a pad, and then they'd go into produce with a little sand, and then they'd finish up with a pad. But the sand concentration was still only about 0.05 pounds per gallon, really modest. And they used 40/70 sand. So you don't really need big proppant. You're creating shear fractures. They don't have you're not going to have a lot of fracture width there to try to put proppant into. So you don't want to put big proppant in there for fear you might screen out, if that makes sense. Yeah, pounds per gallon. Yeah. It's like sprinkling it in. Right. Yes, sir.
You have to go back at some point to get back to closure. You just wait for it to close on its own.
So the question was, do you have to flow back or do you allow the well to close? No, you want to allow the well you want to just shut the well in and allow the pressure to close. That allows you to measure that change in pressure when it's shut in, and you can calculate your effective KH of the fracture you created with that using conventional pressure fall off test software. So you just want to shut it in and let the pressure drop off. Now, if you're fracking a shale well, that might take some time. So you may not want to do that on every stage, but yeah, you want to shut it in because you want to measure that pressure fall off so that you can calculate your frac KH. Well, most of this work has been done daylights, and all the work they did in PetroChina, those are all that's all daylight operations. So they're typically on a well 6 days. They rig up for a day, treat for 4 days, and rig down a day. So for a vertical well, that's typically what they're doing. If you ran 24 operations, of course, you would cut that in half, but they typically are just doing daylights. Yeah.
Don't believe me.
What effect does your stress contrast have on these?
I'm sorry?
Your stress contrast, in other
Yeah.
words, the difference in stresses?
Yeah. Yeah.
Correct.
Stress anisotropy.
Yeah.
It has a huge effect. In some cases, the greater your stress anisotropy, the harder it is to create complex fractures because, frac wants to propagate in one direction. But the paper that I showed you on by PetroChina in the Chang 7 formation, that's a formation that has a high degree of stress anisotropy, and they still were able to get very effective creation of complex fractures around the wellbore with that. So I haven't seen a place yet where it doesn't work. Doesn't mean there aren't any out there. Just haven't seen anybody publish any papers saying we tried it here and it didn't work. So, okay. Yeah.
Dave Sabo with Energy Transform. I'm curious, the modeling methodology that you demonstrated were, small, medium, large, induced incremental fracs. Have you been able to apply that against some of the PetroChina or Pertamina actual field data?
Yeah. Yeah. So the question is whether or not the modeling work we've done, whether it applied to any of the previous work that was done by Pertamina or PetroChina. And I would say yes. The answer is yes, we have.
So your methodology has been applied on some of those actual field examples.
So yes, the question was again, have we tried modeling this process against some of the other field examples? The answer is yes.
That should be pretty strong evidence for operators to take this up in the
I'm sorry?
That should be pretty strong evidence for operators picking this up.
It is, but I can't share all the data with everybody. So again, all these technical papers are pretty strong evidence this technology works. Any questions?
I don't believe we have any from the Zoom audience.
Okay.
Could I ask one more question?
Okay.
So seems like it's got great application in depleted reservoirs. You mentioned initially that you have to get up to that initial breakdown pressure, and then you cycle from that point, correct?
Correct.
If you go into a depleted reservoir, are you able to start to achieve these incremental fracs at a lower pressure, given the changed stress associated with depletion? So
the question was whether or not this technology will work in depleted reservoirs where you have lower pressure to start with. The fracture pressure of the formation is relatively independent of the formation pressure that the formation might be at, whether it's a depleted reservoir or an undepleted reservoir. The fracturing pressure is about the same. So
would you have to repressure with fluid in a depleted reservoir? Intuitively, I was thinking that you'd be able to achieve these fracs with less effort, i.e. less horsepower on surface.
So I'm not sure what your question is. If it was the difficulty in doing this in depleted reservoirs. because you need to pump more fluid for longer?
Or less fluid for less time
Yeah.
to achieve, right?
Well, every reservoir is different. So a sandstone that has 500 millit RC permeability is going to behave differently than one that has 0.1 millit RC permeability. And so you need to design your treatment to take into consideration the formation characteristics and the fluid characteristics. So, but there's no reason this technology won't work in depleted formations. It clearly has been shown to do that, so.
But yeah, that's actually my question. I'm thinking it should be very effective in depleted reservoirs with even less horsepower required.
Yes, but I showed you a paper where it's been done in a mature water flood, so that's at full pressure, so. Yeah, so, okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Following up on his question, I've seen fracs where breakdown pressure is lower than hydrostatic and closure pressure never happens when pressure drops to zero. So what do? You can't, essentially you're pumping blind in that case?
So you're talking about, the question is, what do you do with the reservoir that has a fracture initiation pressure less than hydrostatic? I haven't come across one of those yet. Are you talking about maybe a coal seam?
Oh, they're sandstone reservoirs.
Okay,
I did a bunch of horizontals out west of town here a couple of years ago.
okay,
And we didn't use proppant at all because the stress was so low, there was no closure.
right, okay. Well, that's a special case. I mean, that usually doesn't happen very often unless you're dealing with really shallow formations. And I don't know what to advise you there. I mean, if your hydrostatic is way above your fracture initiation pressure, obviously the well's not going to maintain a static fluid level. Your permeability is probably really high, so this is probably not an application for that one. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
It's actually combining this.
Sure, yeah. I have no idea. Would you like to
show you where we're located?
Yeah, I'd love to.
All right, thanks everyone for coming, and we'll look forward to the next one next quarter.